We've seen from looking at cases that our clients have become involved with that the focus of the regulator seems to be shifting from the company and the company's actions to the individuals themselves.
I have seen that, and I think it's something we've heard the enforcement agencies announce publicly, that they really see the individuals as key to deterrence. Because when a company does something wrong, how does it do it? It does it through individuals. And how do you really send a message to individuals? Well, if the companies are settling the cases and taking the fines, but it doesn't get down to the individual level, do you really drive the lesson home?
What surprised me is some of the cases are obvious, so the CFO, the CEO, the sales director, but it seems like some of the recent activity, it's getting a little more broad.
There has been and will continue to be a focus on gatekeepers, because the enforcement agencies really see people in the risk control functions, the compliance functions, as sort of the first line of defense. And I think one of their questions about whether a compliance program is effective is, where are the gatekeepers? Are the gatekeepers seeing the issues? Are they catching them? And what are they doing when they do?
There was a recent case where the government declined to pursue the investigation further, and it seemed like that company was one that had a very robust program. Can we talk a little bit about what you've seen in that program or that policy?
Yeah, I think that is a really significant case. It came out in April of 2012, and there the government charged an individual at the company and did not charge the company, and was very vocal, and this is really the first time we've seen this, very vocal about why it wasn't charging the company. And when the government went through the reasons it was proceeding against the individual and not the company, it explained the comprehensive compliance program that the company had. I mean, this was a company that had trained people in the relevant region 54 times. You really had a very documented record of impressive compliance. The government, I think, there was reacting to some of the criticism that companies had, which is, we don't know when the government doesn't bring a case. We only hear about the cases they do bring, and not the ones they don't bring. And I think that was, in some ways, my guess, a way to answer those critics.
We've seen a lot of sanctions of bad behavior. The flip side of that is, how do you incentivize good behavior?
I think one thing companies are asking is, are we going to get credit for all that we're doing in this area? And I think the more that the government can send the message that you will get credit, the more companies, management, boards will see that it's worth the investment.
Are you seeing the audit committees or boards getting more engaged or more involved in this topic?
What I'm seeing is more interest by boards in the details than what we've seen in the past.
That asking more questions.
Exactly,
or getting more
wanting presentations on compliance. I mean, that's a relatively recent thing, that boards want to hear about the compliance program. They want to hear from the chief compliance officer. One of the things in recent Justice Department and SEC settlements is how much of a reporting relationship is there between the chief compliance officer and the board and the audit committee, and they really see that as a sign of a good compliance program.
The thing we've talked a lot with our compliance colleagues and clients about as well is, how do they demonstrate that there's value being added from this process, so that this is something that helps the company meet its strategies or meet a goal or manage key risks in emerging markets. I mean, are you seeing similar dialogue from your clients? Or
showing that you have a good compliance apparatus can be seen not as an obstacle to doing business, but as part of what helps you do business in newer markets safely. And I think boards want to know that that compliance infrastructure is in place when they hear a company's going into a new market.
Let's talk about when things might go wrong, because they do sometimes, and an incident happens, and companies are thinking through some initial steps. How do I approach the incident? How do I manage it? Can you talk about some of the things when you get involved from a legal perspective? How do you help companies think that through, and what are some of the key things they should be focused on?
Every case is different in terms of the facts that you're dealing with, the jurisdictional arguments that there are, how high up in the company the problem goes, how widespread it is. So I really think that it's not kind of a binary decision, you disclose, don't disclose, but you have to look at all of the facts kind of as a whole picture. Some of the factors we always focus on are, again, how pervasive and widespread the conduct is. Is it just one country? Is it a whole region? Is it across the whole company? how high up does it go? Is it senior managers? Because the more serious it is, the more you would think about disclosing it. Is it something that the company really can address on its own because it's fairly isolated and you can fairly easily discipline people, remediate, terminate wrongdoers? I mean, is it something that can be handled in that way, or is it something much more systemic in terms of the business model or how business is won in a particular area that is more difficult to remediate? Those kinds of things are the things that we take into account when deciding whether it's something to disclose or something that can be addressed without disclosure.
Based on looking at the cases, are there any real benefits or tangible benefits that companies are realizing from the decision to voluntarily disclose?
I think there is a benefit, and I've seen it in my own cases. It can be a benefit in terms of the size of the fine, the conduct that is charged. Is it going to be 1 count, 2 counts, and all of that drives the size of the penalties. There can be benefits in terms of how the government will describe the conduct and whether you have success in negotiating the language that's used in the settlement documents. So there are a number of areas in which I think there is a tangible benefit. The question always is that enough of a benefit compared to what your alternatives are?
As far as industries go, it almost seems like the government at different times has had a focus on different industries. It almost seems like now the financial services industry has come under the spotlight somewhat. I mean, do you see that changing? Do you see this going in different areas, or those industries continuing to be a focus?
Well, I think the whole trend of industry-wide investigations is fairly new. For the government to take a look at an industry and say, we think that this is potentially systemic throughout the whole industry. Like there's a certain way that this industry goes to market that would apply across multiple companies, and we want to take a look at it. And I think financial institutions is a good example. We know that there is a sweep going on that the SEC is doing of financial institutions' dealings with sovereign wealth funds. You and I both have seen in our practice focus on maybe more non-traditional kinds of financial institutions, private equity, hedge funds. So I think the government sees it as an area where there's potential issues, corruption issues. These are companies that are in a lot of emerging markets, may use third parties to get business, which has always been kind of a perennial risk area. So I suspect it is something that we will see a continued focus on, as well as some other industries.
Speaking about third parties, and a lot of our cases involve them one way or another, whether it's entering into the relationship with a third party, managing what the third party's doing. Maybe can you talk a little bit about that, and maybe when issues are happening at clients, what are some of the areas that they're having trouble with?
What I sometimes see is that where a particular relationship doesn't fit into a clear bucket, it sometimes falls through the cracks. So sometimes a company has a really great program for vetting third-party sales reps that are paid commission, but as soon as someone is a third party that interacts potentially with government customers that doesn't quite fit that mold, they might not realize this is a third party that needs to go through our diligence process. We see companies run into problems where they sort of have rigid ideas of the intermediaries that are subject to due diligence from an anti-corruption standpoint, and then they've got a new relationship that doesn't quite fit that mold.
Are there other things that you're seeing, as trends across your cases, or that you're advising your clients on the enforcement side?
I mean, in some ways, I feel like one of the trends is that the old trends still apply, in that if you look at what are the cases that have come out recently about, almost all of them are third-party cases. The use of third-party intermediaries to get business, whether that's a sales agent paid a commission or a distributor or a reseller, that third-party risk is just common to so many FCPA cases, and the need for due diligence. But that just continues to be one of the biggest, if not the biggest, risk area in the FCPA. Any kind of industry that does business through intermediaries of whatever kind, that's just a continued area of risk. And then the other is travel and entertainment. I mean, you would think this is a minor issue, companies kind of have a handle on it, and yet we've seen 3 or 4 cases in the past 2 years that have been about travel, entertainment, gifts, kind of the usual stuff. And so those continue to be areas that the government focuses on and that companies have problems with.
From a legal perspective, when you get engaged in more of a proactive discussion with your clients, what are some of the other things that are on their mind, or that you might be helping them with?
Well, I think the risk assessment piece is key, and that's fairly recent. It's really only been in the past few years, as more of the enforcement actions have come out and have mentioned risk assessments, that people have really thought about them. But the risk assessment idea is something somewhat new to them, to think about, okay, we need to talk about at a higher level, where are we doing business, how are we doing business, to think about whether we have gaps in our program and do that gap analysis.
Some of the potential penalties or risks are obvious, right? So I might be sanctioned, I'm going to have a fine, et cetera. But it seems like from a legal perspective, companies could face additional risks if they find themselves in one of these situations.
Well, I mean, a huge one is suspension and debarment, and from government contracting. And it's not only an issue for people who are companies that are U.S. government contractors, but if you get blacklisted by the World Bank, say, that will then have repercussions for a number of other contracting agencies, because a lot of these agencies look at each other and say that if you're on one blacklist, you're sort of blacklisted among them all.
It seems like from our perspective, the anti-bribery provisions, they're there, but a lot of times they're hard to prove, or they're hard to see. So a lot of these cases come back to the internal controls and the books and records. So we spent a lot of our time talking to the CFO, talking to the controller, trying to figure out when a payment happens, how does it get recorded? I imagine you're seeing similar issues or challenges, and curious how you've advised your clients in that area.
Yeah, I mean, this is one that's somewhat difficult to explain, because the statute doesn't tell you how you have to book a transaction. It just says the transaction has to be booked accurately and transparently. But one of the things in one of the cases that I recently did that was an issue was the way payments to third parties that were commissions were booked was in a way where if you went back through and audited the books and records, they weren't identified as commissions. And it made it difficult to come back through and audit and see what those payments were. And the government had real concerns about that, because they felt like even though there wasn't actually anything inappropriate with the transactions, the audit trail was totally opaque, and they had concerns about that. And they're a very powerful tool for the government. I mean, we recently saw a case where the SEC charged commercial bribery as a books and records issue, even though there was no foreign payment at stake. It wasn't a foreign bribery issue. And that's where you see the books and records being a very powerful tool for the government to be able to charge conduct really of any stripe where they see impropriety.